Hello and welcome to the Magic Piano Advent Calendar. Today is Wednesday, the 22nd of December, and we are nearing the end of our Advent calendar. And it's a great pleasure for me to do another interview today with Kumaran Arul from Stanford University. He is a lecturer there in music, and most importantly, he's one of the directors of the player piano program at Stanford University. And we have been working together for the past few years in planning the global piano roll meetings, first the online preludes that happened over the last 2 years. And in June 2022, hopefully we'll finally have the in-person conference at Bern and Seven. So hello, Kumaran. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Sebastian. Yeah, great to have you. Thanks for having me, I should say. And I have been very excited to see the Magic Piano and the work at Bern. And I think this is a wonderful compliment, and taking also as well compliment to all the other work that's happening around the world to draw attention to rolls. But also it's a step forward, I think, in many ways, putting much of this material out with a curated and some discussion about the material, so that we can get better context for it. So it's wonderful to have that.
Thank you. I would like to speak to you first a bit about the player piano program at Stanford, and especially your digitization efforts, because in many ways you are a role model to what we do in Bern, because you were the first large institution that digitized and also published online scans and emulations of roll recordings for scientific analytical purposes. And yeah, I would like to ask you a bit, when you started this, what was your goal? What were you aiming at with putting online scans of rolls?
Well, we obviously wanted to make rolls accessible to researchers and to listeners, to collectors, to aficionados. But I have to say that from the very beginning, which in our case started with our acquisition of the Condon roll and player collection from Australia in 2014, that we really were figuring out very much what needs to be done with rolls. It's been a learning process, and to this day, I would say we keep learning from and iterating the next steps that need to happen to make access more available, but better quality, and to do what really needs to be done with rolls. It's not an easy arena to work in. It's a very complicated area. And I think digitizing brings with it a lot of challenges, a lot of steps. And I think it is still ultimately, while it is very useful and very important, and I think it might be the way forward in some senses, I think it can still only and should only complement all the other types of research and scholarship and exposure that we get to the original players and to the original rolls as well. So it's still one step in the whole process of understanding rolls. I would add that I was also inspired, and we were inspired very much by some of the same sources that many of us are, which I was so thrilled to see yesterday, your discussion with Rex. So Rex Lawson, of course, was one of my first experiences with rolls and pianolas in person back in the early 2000s. And it was sort of life-changing for me too, in many ways. I didn't realize that rolls could do all that. And he's been a wonderful advocate for rolls. And Rex was very much a part of helping us at Stanford get started. He was there in Australia, actually helping us sort materials with us, and came to our gala opening sort of concert in 2015 and performed and so forth. So we've had very important help from collectors and people who've been doing this a lot longer than we have as well.
Yeah, so did we, and that's why it was also so important to me to include them in this video series, and I'm so grateful that so many of them agreed to that, like Hans Schmitz and particularly also Peter Phillips, who helped us a lot with coming up with solutions for emulations and so. Something that you mentioned that my talk with Rex, something that I discussed with him also is a thing that I only really became aware of during the last weeks when publishing the videos of the Advent calendar, that there is a slight paradox. For me, the main reason why I want to digitize rolls and why I also want to make them available in digital form as scans, as MIDI files, as emulations, is because to me, that's the most reliable way of accessing them for analysis, for performance analysis and research. But of course, we are all musicians, and we know that the easiest way to grasp a concept of an interpretation is not by measuring it or by looking at a MIDI file, but by listening to it. And I think it's probably the same what happens to you. The first approach to the roll is still the listening experience. And there, yes, the digitization also makes it easier maybe to listen to them, to listen to all of them in more or less the same conditions and the same quality. But it's certainly not something that is on already on the same level as hearing the rolls performed on a real instrument. And so although this might help to make the rolls more accessible and to inspire people also to listen to it, that's not, for me at least, not the main thing why I need it in digital form. How is it for you?
Yes, I think there are many different purposes ultimately, and we have to acknowledge all of them. I, to some extent, like you, was interested in performance analysis. I am a musician, I'm a pianist first and foremost. I was trained as a pianist. And my interest in rolls actually derived from my interest in simply hearing recordings, early recordings in general, which started with sound recordings and then just extended to rolls. And I'm still very much interested in sound recordings, and I use sound recordings in tandem with rolls very much. I feel like we can't understand rolls without sound recordings to give them context. So my interest was in applying it very much to performance. So this is something that I found as part of my interest in performance practice. So it has to do with trying to understand 19th century music through their 19th century styles, you could say. And I think a study of the history of performance shows that a lot has changed in the 20th century. There have been great developments in society and in musical style as well. And we have evidence of that across the 100 years of recording, very clear evidence, you could say. And in some cases, those changes have been so drastic, as, for example, to some extent in Beethoven performance, and we can talk about that a bit later in this discussion with regards to the Beethoven recordings we're looking at here, that people have to some extent whitewashed. They have tried to ignore the early history of Beethoven performance because it doesn't fit with what they believe to be the way we want to hear Beethoven. And so it's caused a lot of controversy at times to even acknowledge these roles. I would even say that roles were purposefully ignored at times because they presented information that wasn't palatable, that wasn't suitable for mass consumption. And people wrote them off as also defective and problematic. All of the problems of roles, you could say, served their benefit, served their purposes just fine, to allow them to ignore that whole legacy. But thankfully, for all of this new work, we're able to sort of uncover as much true, authentic detail as possible. And I think that requires an analytical approach. I think we have to be scrutinize, for example, the irregularities and to discuss whether or not those are artifacts of the roll production or whether they are what the performers actually did. And that sometimes requires great, precise digital reproduction. So where we actually can see every hole and discuss whether or not it should have been placed in 1 millimeter forward or backward. And that then goes into all sorts of esoteric digital reproductive concerns like matrix reconstruction, which Wayne Stanke, and we'll have a paper on that in the June conference, Tim Baxter, are interested in, correcting the roles, making them as refined, as precise as they were meant to be. So I do have an interest in all sides of that. You could say the technical reproduction of roles is important because it gets to their musical essence. But it also then can be used even to put into practice. And the way we put it in practice is indeed, as Rex suggested in the interview, a matter of listening to it and taking in what it has to say. It is not enough to merely see it in some graphical analysis. I agree fully with that. I think there has to be that final level as a performer, as a musician, of grasping what is actually happening. And on that front, I have to say roles and early recordings in general may present huge challenges. They create the new worlds for us to understand. They have really new arenas. And I think some of these early Beethoven recordings are among the most challenging, because I think we've come so far from that conception of Beethoven. And it's easy to discount them, but when we know that, for example, D'Albert and Lamond were considered great Beethoven players in their day, and both of them studied with Liszt or worked with Liszt, who by some counts was one of the great performers of even Beethoven in the day. And that obviously becomes a cultural waypoint. It's not that everyone thought that Liszt was the ultimate representative of performance. Certainly Clara Schumann and others might not have, but we see those differences, and we can measure all of this and understand all of this using this early legacy of roll recordings as some of our data, so it's incredibly valuable on that front.
And I think this approach from different angles toward the roles, and also in the context of other early recordings like disc recordings or cylinder recordings, that's something which we do very similar in Bern and at Stanford. And we also still care for the real instruments. I mean, you have with the Condon collection not only the rolls, but you have a large collection of instruments. We don't have it at the university, but the museum in Zeven is our closest partner in all of these projects. And there we have also almost all the types of reproducing pianos. So these things need to go together, in my opinion, and also the technical and the musical perspective. And I think as long as research can bring all of these things together, and I think that was also one of our main motivations for the program of the conference in June, that it should really equally represent all these different topics. And I'm very much looking forward to see that.
Absolutely. I still think there's some very important research to be done on the instruments, even with regards to emulation. And it's not just me who thinks that. Rex alluded to that yesterday, doing pneumatic modeling, essentially, of what is actually going on in the side of the instrument. It's been done to some extent. Peter Phillips has been taking measurements, but Wayne Stanke, among others, believes very much that there needs to be a much more extensive work done in this arena, and that it would affect the outcome of the digital emulated models as well. So I think they can serve a critical function just with regards to digitization. But independent of that, two things I wanted to say. One was I shouldn't neglect, in my bias, the huge, vast legacy of popular rolls, so-called popular rolls, that is non-reproducing rolls, 88-note rolls. This is really the vast majority of the roll legacy, actually. The reproducing rolls are a smaller fraction of that. And they also hold riches. They hold incredible value to us. And I think it should be important to recognize how much of a legacy that is. At Stanford, we are collecting, our collection includes more non-reproducing rolls than reproducing rolls. And we very much intend to scan and digitize those as well. But as people like Rex and Bob Berkman and others would claim, this requires interaction and playback involvement by a pianolist, and that for it to optimally be conveyed. And I think that that is something that might also need to be done digitally to some extent. And we are working on that at Stanford with a new tool that we have. But either way, I think instruments will play a critical role there, so to speak. They need to actually be available for people to utilize to recreate, popular roles as well as reproducing roles. And yes, they will require also more investment. It's more difficult, I would say, to manage instruments than just a scanner and the rolls. I mean, I think it causes a lot more investment. It takes space. It takes pneumatic technicians like Joshua Rapier, who we had earlier in the series, and they are very high maintenance. They require a lot of upkeep, and they have to be every time tweaked to make sure they're working perfectly. But I think it's important that we actually invest in that. It's very important for the legacy of rolls as well, to keep instruments and to keep them working well, which is that's I should say even more rare. It's relatively common to find player instruments. It's extremely uncommon to find them working very well. So, and that's our real task, I would say. So yeah, I agree with you though. Yeah, very important.
So I think we can go on to talk a bit about the music on the rolls. And for today, I've chosen a roll, a rather early roll, number 236. That's a roll played by Xaver Scharwenka with Beethoven's Sonata Opus 90. And you also already mentioned Beethoven. We focused a bit on Beethoven in our series with the Advent calendar and with the entire Magic Piano project, actually. There was an, I would say, external reason for that, and that is that the Magic Piano project was created in the Beethoven anniversary year. But there is also an intrinsic reason from our research to focus on Beethoven, because we have discovered that almost any kind of discussion on musical interpretation and taste and style in the 19th century focused on Beethoven. And also that, at least in my experience, the early Beethoven interpretations diverge even further from what we are used to hear today, maybe even more than recordings of romantic composers. But I don't know how you see that. So that was the reason why we wanted to include quite a lot of Beethoven here. And now we can look back and review this variety of different Beethoven recordings.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree fully with you. I think Beethoven is a giant, in the era of Western music. He plays a huge outsized role in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And I think as a result, he's a perfect representative for all sorts of values and ideals. And I think you could say there's been a lot of musicological work done on how Beethoven has been appropriated, you could say, for different purposes amongst different interest groups, political, social, cultural. I think one portion of that story that hasn't been fleshed out is to understand the role that performance style and performance practices, so performance history of Beethoven performance itself, what role and how that can evidence, in some senses, the ways in which Beethoven has meant different things to different people. And I think it would be, a good development for performance practice scholarship itself to challenge itself to understand Beethoven's styles in something more than merely a sort of catalog of the specific devices that are being utilized in Beethoven performances on early rolls and early sound recordings. In other words, to move it beyond the documenting of the actual practices and to try to understand what those practices might have symbolized and represented. And I say that because Beethoven himself has so much outsized cultural value, and it was deemed that way. And further, that there is good evidence to suggest that the way you perform Beethoven in the 19th century was sort of laying a stake in the ground, so to speak. It had some claim to where you wanted to ally yourself with musically and culturally. And this is most apparent between the Lisztians and the conservatives, you know. And interestingly, on roles, we have some of the best evidence of this conflict and this disparity. The conservatives, we can talk about people like Reinecke and the Clara Schumann students. Reinecke is a perfect example, actually. He's in many ways the perfect representative of the conservative schools, what I call the conservative schools, which is not maybe super apparent. It needs more fleshing out and some research and writing. But then on the other hand, Liszt seemed to overtly, Liszt and Wagner, by the way, critical guide in this whole matter based on his writings, seems to put Reinecke in a certain box. And Reinecke, as the head of the Leipzig Conservatory, was a very important figure and was sort of, again, representing something. And Leipzig was also representing something in the 19th century, apparently, in so many fashions. So we have this whole, this conflict, you could say, played out. We have lots of evidence of it played out on recordings of rolls. So this is all new research, and I have to say I'm excited and thrilled. One of the things I should have said back when one of my goals of recordings and doing the roll project was merely to hear the rolls. There are so many rolls that we simply don't have access to. I mean, there were recordings made, CDs and other, you know, media. We've had recordings going back to LPs, even 78s of rolls, but there are still hundreds and hundreds of important rolls that we've never heard. And I think
yes, and it was striking for me to see that although there are quite a lot of Beethoven rolls, those were not the ones that were mainly republished and reissued on CDs. Some of them, yes, but not the majority. The interest was clearly more in the romantic repertoire, and of course with composers playing their own music. And so, but it's not that we kind of are anywhere close to having a full reissued rollography of Beethoven rolls. Not at all.
Absolutely. I think, you know, the Scharwenka right here, there are things that he does in this roll that are simply not doable today. You'll have a teacher wrap you over the wrists for doing that. You know, he's rushing in places like in bar 67, the octaves. He just suddenly speeds them up. And it's a device. He's doing it particularly for effect. He does it both times, every time it recurs, that particular device. But his hands are dislocated in some places. He's taking tempo changes. And we also have as well the D'Albert Opus 90, which you know, is not included on this, but it's we will be shortly. I think you have that roll, and as
we have that too, we'll put it on our website, and then everyone has the opportunity to compare these recordings. I mean, that's anyway something that I believe we learn the most from, is not to look at only one recording, but to look at several of them of the same piece from the same time. And in this case, with the Opus 90, there are many more also on other roll systems. We see that Konrad Ansorge, one of the other great Beethoven players and another Liszt student, he recorded the same piece on a Hupfeld roll. And we have Karl Friedberg, of whom a sound recording, a relatively late sound recording, survived. So we can really pinpoint a bit who belonged to what style, and this I think makes a great case study, the Opus 90.
And Opus 90 is wonderful. I agree fully. And other such comparisons, what they show us, they're interesting both for the similarities and then as well their differences. So I think, you will find that there are similar types of liberties that are very common in these early Beethoven performances, which I think, broadly speaking, I was mentioning, feel out of style, out of character for a lot of what we teach today as Beethoven performance, sort of precepts. But then there are also a lot of differences. So Scharwenka and D'Albert are clearly different characters. There's a lot of, in some ways, Scharwenka was born earlier, 1850. You might think of him as the more, maybe the older style player, but in some fashion, I'm not necessarily convinced of that. D'Albert feels as if in some ways 1864 is a little later. But he seems to take on what I've felt is a Lisztian approach to Beethoven, which has some particular old-fashioned attributes which they felt were appropriate to Beethoven. And this is true of D'Albert, but also Frederick Lamont, who I think is another very important early Beethoven player, and one whom we have some wonderful examples, critical early recordings on roll as well. We also have sound recordings of both D'Albert and Lamont, which help us put them into context.
I think in the case of Lamont, we fortunately even have the opportunity that he recorded the same sonatas both on disc and on rolls. At least the Opus 13, the Pathétique, is available in 2 versions, and there are 20 years or so between these recordings. So you can already recognize a change within the same player after 20 years. But if you then compare it to others, yeah, it opens up an extremely wide field of choices that these players took. And
yeah, and I might just add, and we could probably wrap it up here, but I just wanted to add that it's such a rich world of reference that we always think of them as Liszt students, and I think that's certainly what sort of stands out. But actually, it's arguably with Beethoven, I almost like to draw a closer legacy to Hans von Bülow, who was actually one of the more conscious classicists of sorts in the late 19th century. He was one of the first to perform big cycles of the Beethoven sonata, including the last 5 sonatas together. And Lamont actually studied with Bülow before he studied with Liszt. He was actually at Bülow at the conservatory, and then Bülow invited him to Meiningen to play Brahms' second, I believe, concerto. And then he introduced him to Liszt. And he spent really just a summer with Liszt, and then Liszt showed up at his debut. And so there's a lot of, and I think Bülow maybe even had an impact on Liszt's understanding of Beethoven to some extent. So it's interesting that there's a complex reference. Bülow may be a sort of amalgam between some of the conservatives and the romantics as well in his fashion towards Beethoven. So a lot of fascinating historical clues, you could say, are found in these early recordings. We don't have recordings of Bülow, although, by the way, early cylinder recordings were made, but they're lost. We never had recordings of Liszt, but these...
neither of Clara Schumann.
Neither of Clara Schumann, exactly. But all of these early rolls give us some tantalizing evidence as to, how we might understand their performance styles and what they did. So I just wanted to say one other thing briefly, which is, I think these roles are challenging, and I think I say challenging because they don't always hit us as immediately satisfying. And what Rex said, which we just listened to it to enjoy it. I do think there are some people who can take that in, but I have to say, as a trained pianist in our modern day, having come through conservatories and performing and so forth, so many things might strike you as just so far out from our normal way of performing that it's just not possible to sort of enjoy it in the modern sense. And I think that two things to say about that. One, I think that we do have to listen with very open ears, with very a free and open sort of mind to what is there, because this is a historical document and it comes from a different time and a different place. But I also think we can, I say this with some caveats because I'm not trying to excuse the performances, but recordings were a different thing to them at that time. It was not the sort of final document, the sort of your final statement on on the piece, so to speak, that'll be preserved for posterity to the same extent that it was to us today. I think we know, as you mentioned earlier, D'Albert did his session for Welte very quickly. It had a huge program. He threw out lots of works all at once.
At least the second session in 1913, where he recorded, the Liszt Sonata, and I don't know how many Beethoven sonatas, and incredible program to do in one day.
Right. And he was already really focused on composition and conducting, and he had a wide-ranging career. And it's not as if performing the ultimate performance of the Beethoven was all that was on his mind. And that, to varying degrees, is the case with many of them. I think also we can check that by some of their live performances. We do have one live performance of D'Albert, at least, the Beethoven Emperor Concerto, which is an amazing document. But frankly, I think it supports his casualness to some extent. I mean, it's as free and as wild and unfettered. But this is a very elderly man who's now, well beyond he's made his mark and he had nothing to prove. So maybe it feels a little like Horowitz in his 80s, or something like this. He's much more free and unfettered. But Lamon's performances in the 1930s with the Concertgebouw, those live performances are very revealing, I think, in many ways. They put his ability to sort of rein himself in, now playing in an ensemble context. It changes a bit our understanding of him, perhaps. Those are wonderful performances. The Beethoven C minor concerto there is just an amazing document. And we see some of his style. Certainly his style is there, but it's just put into certain context. So we have to not always treat these recordings as if they are the final statement. And I think it requires an open mind. It requires some investigation. It requires other recordings to place them in context. But
and I think also that, at least for me, it sometimes feels like some of the challenge with the Beethoven roll recordings also comes from that this might not be the music that fits the best with the technology, at least not in all the cases. I mean, with all the ingenuity of these reproducing pianos, they have their strong sides and their weak sides, and there are things that they can do extremely well, and others where we really hear that they lack a bit of something that a performer that we would have heard in the live performance of the pianist. And to me, these things show a bit more in Beethoven than maybe they do in a Hungarian Rhapsody by Liszt, or and that might have to do something with the music. And so the challenge is sometimes also that we have to acknowledge that Beethoven's music on rolls might not always sound as agreeable as maybe some Liszt or Schumann does on a piano roll.
It's a very interesting point. We could discuss that further. I'm curious to know exactly what my understanding of what you might be saying is also that, for example, the rolls that have a lot of flashy stuff to them, lots of notes and a lot of brilliance to them, they can in many ways overwhelm the shortcomings of the medium to some extent. And the shortcomings in particular have to do with, I think, fairly obviously to some extent, the nuance of tone production. So to me, as a pianist, even the best instrument, roll reproducing instrument, will fall short in terms of the nuances that can come out of the hands of a fine pianist, which have to do with very fine levels of voicing, even between notes in a chord, for example, or between notes in a hand. I have to say, I've heard there are rolls, individual rolls, that because of their coding and because of the music, the appropriateness of the music, and then the reproduction, like Dennis Hall's instruments in London come to mind, a few examples. I've literally been astonished at how lifelike it sounded, like I was hearing a real pianist. But I would say, on the whole, that is quite rare, even among the particular rolls that we have. And I think that it is a shortcoming, perhaps, that we so subtler music that doesn't have as much to do with very overt musical gestures. Some of those nuances may be missing in the artifacts of roll reproduction. And it could be a harder job for it to communicate what it has to say. That is possible. But I would also just say that I'm not convinced fully of that. I think we're hearing, for example, I used to think a long time that we were hearing a sort of flattening out of the dynamics of these Beethoven performances with Lamin, d'Albert, and so forth, and some lack of color in some fashion because of the roll. But when I hear their live performances and their roll performances, I'm hearing something similar to that too. I mean, their sound recordings, I'm hearing something similar to that too. And it led me to actually a whole arena of sort of theorizing that to some extent, we don't hear as much variety of color, of tonal color on these early styles as we might have heard later in the 20th century, have become accustomed to hearing in the later 20th century. I think of this also, Sebastian, with regards to those Clara Schumann pupils. We have examples of them playing quite a number of sound recordings, even from the 50s recordings. And I just feel like in the touch and timbre of their performing style, I don't hear the same sort of coloristic approach that we might have developed to a greater extent in the 20th century. It's an interesting debate. I'm not saying I conclude this perfectly, but there's some feeling that to some extent Beethoven might have as well as been a sort of there's something almost appropriately conservative classical to almost suggest that the music is presenting itself in a sort of simple fashion. I'm just looking for ways to partly justify some of that aesthetic that I think I hear on these early rolls.
Well, at least I hear nothing that would make me dismiss the rolls as evidence, and everything that I might miss in terms of color and sound or so is actually something that I never had big troubles to, in a way, reconstruct with my inner ear. And I can, so I think I can now appreciate the roles even when listening to them, and kind of overhear what might be missing. It's not that much, actually. I think I agree with what you say, that they don't fall so short from what we hear on early recordings, although there, of course, we also have problems in how well the recording equipment could actually capture these things. And though I must say, I do hear an extreme subtlety and a wonderful control of nuances in some early, especially the early electrical recordings then from the 1920s. If you think of people like Pachmann, the colors he had at his hand, and that's amazing. And that's something I often miss in later 20th century recordings, and also how they dealt with polyphony, especially if you mentioned the Clara Schumann school, where we might have less of these extreme coloristic effects, but a completely different approach to shaping polyphony. And yeah, so
that's right. I mean, I think it's one of the beauties of this era that we find a huge variety of approaches and styles. I think there's not only, as we sort of typically say, they were individuals, they were romantic individuals, sort of individual performers who had their individual styles. But I think we hear a lot of diversity in fundamental approach. And I sometimes even put them into little schools and camps. I wouldn't put Pachmann quite in the same camp as d'Albert, even though there's some similarities. Pachmann was it seems to be even more coloristic for his time, and I don't know whether he was thought of as a Chopin player in some ways. Maybe that legacy somehow, is what we're hearing. But in any case, it is a wonderful, rich arena of exploring. And I think, again, the roles are a critical data point. They bring us so much new material. And I think we're really still at the forefront of this. I don't feel like I'm still hearing new recordings, you know, that I haven't heard. I have to say, by the way, collectors and even Rex, for example, had access to a lot of Welte recordings. They did not have access to Hupfeld recordings, for example. And it's been wonderful to get to know you guys in Bern and also others in Germany, where Hupfeld players and roles are all over the place. And so it's been a wonderful thing for us to be able to suddenly hear a whole new repertoire that we saw in some catalogs. The Sitzky catalog mentions them, but we just thought they were out of reach.
And especially for Beethoven, I think that is something that we definitely need to look at too, because yeah, with Welte, I think also in our Magic Piano project, with the end of the next year, we'll come pretty close to having really the vast majority of all the Beethoven roles. Not all of them, some especially from the very early ones, some are probably lost. But yeah, I think we'll really have the majority of them by the end of the next year. But it's a completely different challenge with Hupfeld or Duca. And if you look into the Duca catalog for Beethoven, some of the sonatas were recorded 3 times by different pianists. Sonatas like the 111, I think there is a recording by Busoni, there is one by Julius Röntgen, and there is a third one, might be Ansorge or so. So that opens up so many more possibilities for comparing, that will be the next challenge to look for these roles.
Absolutely. I think there's still so much to be found, so much to be discovered. And then again, scanning them both preserves that role through the image process, and as well then allows the easy access, you could say, immediate access, you know. So it'll be wonderful to hear that. I'm excited to see some of those recordings and hear some of them for the first time. The Busoni 111, have we heard that yet? Is there any release of that? I've never heard that.
I've never heard that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a monumental landmark recording to hear something like that from Busoni. I've never heard it. I mean, it would be an amazing thing to hear that. So one of many things yet to be uncovered, much work to be done. So
yeah,
yes, we need to get on with it.
So
yeah,
I think we'll continue with listening to the roll. And Kumar, thank you so much for joining me. It was a great pleasure having you here. And also thank you that you followed our Advent calendar with such great interest and appreciation. And yeah, I'm hoping really that we will finally be able to meet next year. I mean, we have been planning and talking on Zoom now for, I think, more than 3 years, but we have never actually met in person. So let's hope that this can finally happen next June. And
absolutely, yeah, very, very hopeful, and we will look forward to it for sure. So thank you, Sebastian, for having me, and I will continue these discussions certainly offline as well.
Yes. So enjoy the holidays. Have a good New Year, and see you then.
Okay,
Bye.
I'll see you. Yeah.